Hello, my name is Alex Purves, and I'm the chair of the Department of Classics. I want to welcome you all to this special roundtable event on plagues in antiquity. We had over 350 people sign up for this event, and we are pleased to welcome you to these presentations and the concluding discussion. This lecture series is possible due to the generosity of UCLA alumna Joan Palevsky, whose bequest to the department enables us to bring leading scholars to campus for this annual lecture. Tonight, since we cannot meet in person, we have instead chosen a topic, the ancient plague, as a focus for a roundtable discussion between faculty from our department and special guest and UCLA alum, Henry Gruber. I hope that this gathering can offer a cross-section of some of the scholarly approaches and interests in our department and beyond. Before I introduce our speakers, however, let me say a few words about the person in whose honor we are meeting tonight. The name of Joan Palevsky will be familiar to many of you. This extraordinary and extraordinarily modest woman was a child of the Depression, graduated from UCLA in 1947, earned a master's degree in French from the University of Wisconsin, and then returned to teach at UCLA from 1949 to 1956. Gloria Steinem described Joan Palevsky as a woman of resources, and this was true in many senses. She was passionate about politics and feminism, passionate about public education and the arts, and passionate about civil liberties and civic participation. All of this can be seen reflected in her generous donations to the University of California Press, the UCLA Library, and the California Community Foundation. She was also a good friend to the Department of Classics. As early as 1982, she established in the Classics Department the Helen Caldwell Merit Scholarship in honor of her former teacher, a fund which we now use to give awards to outstanding undergraduates in classics. Upon Joan's death, the department was the fortunate recipient of two endowments. The first of them is used to bring distinguished scholars to UCLA, of which the Annual Palevsky Lecture is a part. The second funds a graduate fellowship. Indeed, many of the graduate students in the audience today are recipients of that fund. The Department of Classics is then delighted to dedicate this occasion to the memory of Joan Palevsky. The chain of reception that brought her together with Helen Caldwell is extended now in a different context, as all of us who are fascinated by the ancient world work together to explore the richness and complexities of its legacy. I hope that you will join with Joan Palevsky in supporting the work of the Department of Classics here at UCLA. The department has one of the top-ranked programs in the country and has brought together an extraordinary group of talented faculty and students from the Americas, Europe, and Asia. We are in the midst of an energizing process of renewal, with several recent faculty hires and the creation of new courses in classics that will ensure that our undergraduate students continue to thrive, taking classes that are relevant to them and to today's world. Through Joan's generosity and vision, I am pleased to welcome four of our distinguished faculty. First, David Blank, our moderator for this evening. David is a professor in the department who teaches several classes on ancient medicine. His interests lie primarily in ancient philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, and philology. First on the panel will be Catherine Morgan, who many of you know as our previous chair. Catherine is professor of classics and her interests range broadly over Greek literature of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. John Papadopoulos is a professor of classics and archaeology who is interested in various aspects of Aegean prehistory and Greek and Italian archaeology, as well as the history and culture of the classical and later periods. Lydia Spielberg is an assistant professor in the department whose interests lie in Roman rhetoric and historiography, with a particular interest in the representation and reproduction of speech in the Roman world. Finally, I'm also very pleased to welcome back Henry Gruber, a 2015 graduate of our post-bac program in classics here at UCLA, and a current PhD candidate at Harvard. Henry's research focuses on the social and economic history of the later Roman Empire and brings together texts with material culture to determine what we mean when we talk about the fall of Rome. Each of our panelists brings a unique view on plagues in antiquity. I am pleased now to bring David Blank to the spotlight to start our short presentations.
Thanks very much, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to welcome you all to be together with us in this virtual space. I'd just like to begin the roundtable by introducing a few themes and questions. Thucydides says that the plague that swooped down, his words, on Athens in 430 was sudden, unexpected, and contrary to all calculation. The calculations that it upset cut right through the society, as did the disease itself. We are grieving the loss of nearly 0.18% of our fellow Americans. Imagine ancient plagues which took the lives of perhaps from 15 to 40% of the population. Laypersons were forced to question all the assumptions by which they were living, where to take shelter, whether to care for or to abandon strangers or even their own loved ones, to seek help from gods, both those who were traditionally worshipped and also those who might be imported for help on this occasion. The civil society, as a whole, had to consider whether there were any measures it could adopt to promote public health or at least limit the damage. How could it continue to provide public services? How could collective undertakings continue? Physicians had their own professional assumptions thrown into disarray. It had been assumed that if you became ill, that was a result of changes in your regimen and the way your regimen fit into the pattern of unusual changes in the weather from one season to the next. If you and many of those around you became ill, then that must be the result of changes in weather that were too great for the human organism to assimilate and that would affect everyone at once. But what can the physician say when one country after another is struck by the same illness without any noticeable change in the weather in all of them together? Shall we say, as the Epicurean philosopher Lucretius said, that our world simply does contain the seeds of such disastrous illnesses, and that those are sometimes massed together by unlucky weather patterns that bring them into our lives and our homes with disastrous consequences? For us, as modern students of antiquity, there are different questions regarding past plagues. So how do we know about them? What sort of testimonies of them do we have to tell us what they saw? Or in some cases, such as Thucydides or Aelius Aristides, who suffered a near-death experience, to tell us what they themselves actually suffered when they had the plague themselves. Can archaeological investigation discover evidence of mass dying and perhaps even of the causes of such die-offs? Do plagues cause collateral effects that leave their mark in the historical record in, for example, changes in religious practice, changes in laws that are meant to influence factors relevant to public health, changes in the records of economic life and the availability of manpower and labor? In the following reports and discussions, we'll hear about aspects of all these considerations in regard to the plague in Athens, in regard to recurrent epidemics in the city of Rome, and in regard to the Great Plague under Emperor Justinian. Now, I'm very pleased to hand over to my dear colleague, Catherine Morgan.
Thank you, David and Alex, and greetings to everyone in the audience. I hope that the day is not too far distant when we can see each other in person again. During the first years of the Peloponnesian War between the Athenian and Spartan alliances in 429 BC, the imperial city of Athens was struck by a devastating plague. This was a city at the height of its military and cultural power, one which could be considered the education of Greece. The plague had an important impact on Athenian conduct of the war, although this won't be my focus here. My colleague John Papadopoulos will shortly lay out for you what we know about the Athenian plague from an archaeological perspective, drawing on the account of the historian Thucydides. Thucydides is an astonishing narrative. My interest lies in the way his account connects the plague to a broader cultural picture. What do plagues do to societies? How should we think about them? The quick answer, of course, is they do nothing good. But I want to spend the next few minutes sketching out some connections between war and plague in Thucydides because they illustrate an interesting feedback loop that still has repercussions even today. Next slide, please. The effects of the plague were appalling. Thucydides narrates how it undermined the civilized norms on which Athenian society was based. Doctors and those who nursed the sick out of nobility were among the first to be infected and die. The numbers of dead were so huge that funerary customs broke down. Some people attempted to throw their dead onto the funeral pyres of others, or would appropriate and light pyres that had been prepared by other families. Next slide, please. But there was worse. Those, says Thucydides, who had previously concealed shameful pleasures, now ceased to do so. They thought, he says, that bodies and possessions were both ephemeral, so they decided to enjoy themselves while they could and to think only of pleasure. No one was eager to act honorably when they did not know if they would ever survive to be held in honor. Immediate pleasure and anything that served it, this was what was considered noble and useful. No fear of gods or mortal law held people back anymore. Worship of the gods seemed to make no difference, and the odds were that you would not live long enough to be brought to trial for any offense. We have a picture not just of physical suffering, but of social breakdown. But how to understand it? What did it mean? Correlation is not the same as causation. Just because one thing happens at the same time as another, it doesn't mean that they're connected. Yet human beings are pattern-making creatures. We want to see the connections, and sometimes we see connections that aren't there. But this is not good science. Next slide, please. Doubtless, some thought that the plague was divine punishment. There were some in Athens who thought so. Thucydides reports that people remembered an oracle given to the Dorian Spartans when they asked if they should go to war with the Athenians. The god Apollo announced that he would himself fight on their side, and Apollo was a god who brought plague. Thucydides the rationalist certainly does not endorse any of this. His picture is of a forgivable, but perhaps intellectually disreputable, search for meaning and for causes. This goal he magnificently disdains. Let doctors and lay people, he says, speculate on what caused so great an upheaval. He will simply say what happened so that people can recognize it in future. And yet, there may be more to it. Research on Thucydides in recent years has shown how much he was influenced by Greek medicine, which was undergoing impressive development in the 5th century. One way of looking at his history is to see it as a clinical account of the epidemiology of war, with war considered as a disease that infects Greece. The use of sickness and medicine as a metaphor in a political context had its roots in the earlier 5th century. Next slide, please. By the time we get to Plato, it is well established. One of the speakers in the Sophist declares that disease and factional politics are the same thing. And Socrates in the Republic also talks about war within Greece as a kind of sickness. Although Thucydides does not buy into theories of divine causation for the plague, he does make an interesting comment early in his history when he is trying to prove that this war was the greatest war ever. Next slide, please. He remarks that the period of the war was characterized by unparalleled numbers of earthquakes, eclipses, and famines, such that old traditions, presumably connecting war with natural disaster, were now considered verified. The culmination of this sentence is the plague which did immense harm and destroyed numbers of people. All these calamities fell on Greece simultaneously with the war. There seems to be an uncanny correlation between war and disasters in the natural world. Now, correlation is not the same as causation, but we're left unsure about how precisely to interpret what he says. How does causation work in times of war and plague? We can see our historian do some interesting thinking here, and I can give you one example. Next slide, please. One of the things that made the plague in Athens so deadly was that the city was crowded. At the beginning of the war, people had moved inside the city walls from the countryside in anticipation of a Spartan invasion. This crowding meant that every spare piece of land was occupied, including a piece of land below the Acropolis called the Pelagikon, which was said to be cursed. Thucydides reports an oracle which said, "The Pelagikon is better fallow." Yet, he observes, in my opinion, if the oracle proved true, it was in the opposite sense to what was expected. For the misfortunes of the state did not arise from the unlawful occupation, but the necessity of the occupation from the war. And though the god did not mention this, he foresaw that it would be an evil day for Athens in which that plot came to be inhabited. This is quite subtle. He doesn't dismiss the oracle, but points out that causation in such situations is complex and not always what we would imagine. The war did not cause the plague, but it made it worse than it would otherwise have been. The war did, however, cause the breakdown of society and political civility all over the Greek world. When Thucydides later describes civil war and political faction on the island of Corfu, he does so in terms that are very reminiscent of the plague. War, factional politics, and plague put wedges into cracks in the fabric of society and open them up. They encourage us to lose our shame and do things that we would normally shrink from. Sometimes they make us more ourselves, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Next slide, please. It's fascinating that one of the symptoms of the plague was a restlessness that never let its victims sleep. Is it a coincidence then that when the Corinthians, allies of Sparta, evaluate the Athenian character, they say, if someone should say that their nature is neither to be at rest themselves nor to let anyone else rest, he would be correct? Is it a coincidence that later critiques of Athenian democracy would condemn it for the pursuit of pleasure and giving in to the impulse to do whatever one wanted? The Athenian character does not cause the plague, but war, faction, and plague give scope to human darkness. Thucydides was a realist. He admired, I think, the achievements of the Athenian Empire, but he was under no illusions as to their cost. His Pericles, leader of the Athenians at the outbreak of the war, is a masterpiece of calm and control, someone who has thought everything through, except that he would die of the plague. Next slide, please. Our notions of control and intellectual mastery are fragile. As his citizens slide into chaos, Pericles tells them that anything which is sudden and unexpected and happens in a way that is least susceptible to calculation enslaves thought. This is what has happened to you in the case of the plague. As we have seen, we can't even be sure how we should interpret an oracle. The sickness in the body and in the body politic exist in an uncanny complicity, and this is as true today as it ever was. These then are my plague thoughts, and I'm now going to turn the virtual podium over to my colleague, John Papadopoulos, so that he can pull us back down into the material world.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Now, much of what we know of the plague of Athens comes from the Athenian historian Thucydides. The outbreak of the plague began in the second year of the Peloponnesian War. And much like the Spanish influenza, there were subsequent waves. The plague returned at least twice to Athens, once in 429 BC and again in the winter of 427, 426. Since our knowledge of the symptoms and the course of the Athenian pandemic relies so heavily on the testimony of Thucydides, who himself contracted the disease and survived, it's important to begin with his text. The relevant passage is too long to quote in full, so I summarize and select critical portions. Next slide, please. Like many pandemics, the plague of Athens arrived from elsewhere. The plague originated, so they say, in Ethiopia, in Upper Egypt, and spread from there into Egypt itself and Libya and much of the territory of the king of Persia. The pandemic appeared suddenly in Athens, first at the port of the Purves, and there is no evidence that the disease was as virulent elsewhere as it was in Athens. The primary reason the plague hit Athens so hard was that the leaders of Athens, faced with the annual invasions by the Spartans and their allies, decided to evacuate the rural population to retreat within the city walls of Athens. Next slide, please. Which you can see outlined here. These are the Themistoclean walls. The policy was, of course, the brainchild of Pericles. And the idea was that the Athenians would rely on their maritime supremacy, their thalassocracy, bringing in supplies of food via their port, while at the same time harassing Spartan troop movements. The policy, however, resulted, as Catherine so nicely said, in overcrowding in an already heavily populated city, estimated at somewhere around 100,000 people at least, before those living in the countryside swooped into Athens. The resulting overpopulation, shortage of resources, including adequate housing, and pressures on limited water supply created this perfect breeding ground for the disease. As for the symptoms, next slide, please. Thucydides writes, and I don't, next slide, please, yeah. And Thucydides writes, people in perfect health, and I won't quote this entire piece. No, go back to the passage, please. Back, there we are. People in perfect health suddenly began to have burning feelings in the head. Their eyes became red and inflamed. Inside their mouths, there was bleeding from throat and tongue, and the breath became unnatural and unpleasant. The next symptoms were sneezing and hoarseness of breath, and before long, the pain settled in on the chest and was accompanied by coughing. Next, the stomach was affected, and so on and so forth. All the time, they were afflicted with insomnia and the desperate feeling of not being able to keep still, which Catherine described. Most of all, they wanted water or to throw their entire bodies into water. Next slide. Thucydides' account of the symptoms are evocatively captured in this wonderful painting by the Flemish artist Michael Schwartz in a work painted in the middle of the 17th century, generally referred to as Plague in an Ancient City, but which is thought to represent the plague of Athens. The painting is right here in LACMA, in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. These were not the only symptoms. As Thucydides continues, the disease first settling in the head went on to affect every part of the body in turn. Some, too, went blind. Those who, when they first began to get better, suffered from a total loss of memory. Words indeed fail, or so says Thucydides, words indeed fail one when one tries to give a general picture of the disease. And as for the suffering of individuals, they seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature to endure. Doctors were unable to do anything, and like most pandemics, those caring for the ill were not only perished in large numbers, they were among the first to die. The pandemic affected both rich and poor. It led to bodies dead or dying piling up in the streets and a certain amount of lawlessness. The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion and law. Funerals were disorganized and curtailed. The dead were heaped on top of each other, left to rot, or thrown into mass graves. Many Athenians resorted to self-indulgences. Thucydides lamented that no human art or science was of any help, and equally useless were prayers made in the temples, consultation of oracles, and so forth. Tragically, as with COVID-19, many people died alone, as no one was willing to risk caring for them, and in many cases, entire households perished. Nevertheless, in his typically cold, almost clinical manner, Thucydides is, as far as I know, among the very first in history to articulate the concept of immunity. In book 251, he states, and I quote, "Yet still the ones who felt most pity for the sick and the dying were those who had had the plague themselves and had recovered from it. They knew what it was like and at the same time felt themselves to be safe, for no one caught the disease twice. Or if they did, the second attack was never fatal." Next slide, please. The pandemic brought the city to its knees, and one of the most prominent victims was, of course, Pericles himself, who succumbed in 429 BC. By the end of the 5th century BC, the Athenians not only lost the war, but their empire. And one wonders what they could have achieved were it not for the pandemic. The historical and philological dimensions of the plague, largely determined and defined by Thucydides, gave rise to all sorts of speculations as to the disease and what caused it. Everything from bubonic plague to, most recently, Ebola or some sort of related viral fever. Some 30 pathogens have been suggested. The International Journal for Infectious Diseases lists 47 scholarly papers dealing with the pathogens for the plague of Athens. But what of the archaeological evidence? Next slide, please. The critical evidence appeared in the mid-1990s during excavations connected with the construction of the Athens Metro in the area of the Athenian cemetery, the Keramikos, or the Potter's Field, one of the main cemeteries of the classical city. The rescue excavations at the corner of Iera Odos and Piraeus Streets revealed the southwest continuation of the cemetery. A total of over 1,000 graves were uncovered of various dates, but the most spectacular find, next slide please, was a simple, roughly circular pit, some 6.5 meters in diameter, containing 89 bodies of men, women, and children in successive layers, all tightly packed and in disorder. It was estimated by the excavator Effi Batsiopoulou Valavani that the original number of those buried was over 150 in this one grave alone. The few pots buried with the dead all point to a date of around 430 or 420 BC. The large number of dead, the hasty manner of burial, as well as the date of the finds, all point to the circumstances of the plague. Next slide, please. Among those buried in the pit was the skeleton of an 11-year-old girl dubbed Myrtis, whose cranium was reconstructed here. In 2005, a DNA study of Myrtis's dental pulp led Dr. Manolakis Papagrigorakis of the Dental School at the University of Athens to find a DNA sequence similar to those of Salmonella enterica, the organism that causes typhoid fever. A second team of researchers, including Professor Beth Shapiro of UC Santa Cruz, so the University of California was all over the program, disputed the results, noting that the technique used by Papagrigorakis and his colleagues was prone to, and let me quote, contamination-induced false positive results, end of quote, a statement remarkably reminiscent of the false positives in the testing of COVID-19. Moreover, it is clear that Thucydides' symptoms and those of typhus or typhoid fever are at variance in certain details. Consequently, we don't know the cause of the plague, and only future analyses might reveal the pathogen that was the cause. But this is the beauty of archaeology, as new techniques and future analyses might uncover all sorts of alternative narratives. The Spanish flu in the early 20th century infected some 500 million people, and the death toll has been estimated at between 17 and 50 million. We do not know the precise death toll of Athens, but it has been estimated that it killed 1/4 of the population of the city. That's over 25,000 people. As of 2 days ago, COVID-19 has infected 141 million people worldwide and caused just over 3 million deaths. 567,000 in the United States alone. The primary lesson from the archaeological evidence from Athens is that there is a whole lot that we don't know or understand about the disease. And what we need is better science and more analyses to determine its nature. The main takeaway from Thucydides is the frighteningly similar accounts of a pandemic 2,500 years ago and one that we're experiencing today. As I noted, the pandemic brought Athens to its knees. COVID-19 has already brought the United States and many other countries to its knees, and particularly the economy of the United States, though evidently not the stock market, as it has the economies of many other countries around the world, including Greece, where Myrtis has been enlisted in the campaign against coronavirus in a video advising viewers to follow medical instructions. As a political entity, Athens never really recovered from the plague. Let us hope that this round history does not repeat itself. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one of the youngest members of our department, Lydia Spielberg, a wonderful specialist in Roman philology. Lydia.
Thank you very much, John, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to move us across the Mediterranean and across languages to talk a bit about plague in the Roman Republic and Roman Empire. So pestilence, severe outbreak, in this case, severe outbreaks of endemic diseases, things like malaria and yellow fever, is a recurring occurrence in the Roman historian Livy's account of the early Roman Republic, often marking the only years when the Roman state was not at war, but also revealing the religious and social consequences of the disease. In the plague of 412 BCE, as Livy reports, was, quote, more menacing than deadly. It turned people's thoughts away from the foreign and political fights towards their homes and the concerns of their bodies. It is believed that the disease did less damage than the unrest would have. This is the unrest that would have occurred in one of the perpetual conflicts over land redistribution, sort of an ongoing battle between the haves of Rome and the have-nots. So unrest here is a kind of disease of the body politic, and one that in some cases, so claims Livy, could be even worse than a medical plague. And there's a similar mixing of medical and social plague in the story that Livy tells of the year 331 BCE. Next slide, please. I only wish, Livy says, that the story was false, that those whose deaths made the year infamous for plague were in fact carried off by poison. And this is what follows is a very odd anecdote from Livy's history. He goes on to explain how all the leading men of Rome in this year fell ill with similar symptoms of disease, leading to the same fatal outcome. So a logical sign of some sort of endemic disease that is particularly severe. But as our story continues, a slave woman approached the magistrates and revealed that it was not disease, but a poisoning plot by the respectable married women of Rome. So as so often subsequently and before, right, a scapegoat is found for a disease, is what we might say. So there is an investigation. 170 women, Livy says, are arrested, and the instigators, who are women of the highest ranks, end up killing themselves by drinking their own poison. So, you know, the story has wrapped up in one sense, but the whole affair is taken as a sign of a different kind of sickness. And this is next slide, please. What Livy calls an insania, right? A sickness in the community, which requires the same kind of expiation that a plague would have. People recalled from the Chronicles, he writes, how during the successions of the plebs in former days, a nail had been hammered in by a dictator, and how men's minds, driven to distraction by civil discord, have been restored to sanity by that act of atonement. They therefore decided that a dictator should be appointed to hammer in a nail. So this odd religious ritual of appointing a dictator, a temporary magistrate with supreme power who abdicates his office after addressing the crisis for which he was appointed, does not in fact show up in Livy as a response to civil unrest in the previous books, but it does show up frequently as an expiation for pestilence. Next slide, please. There are several instances in Livy, and it even shows up in our magistrate list for the year we call 263 BCE. And this is what has been the backdrop of my slides, and I've underlined in blue and magnified a bit, where you can see that Gnaeus Fulvius Maximus Contumalis was named dictator for hammering in the nail. We don't have. So we may also believe that 364 BCE was a plague year. So we can see that in this Roman tradition, as in Thucydides, plague has close connections to other social ills, such as class conflict, such as family dissolution. And in fact, it can become so common a metaphor for civil discord that it sometimes becomes interchangeable with it. Are we hammering in a nail in an ancient religious ritual to prevent class conflict? Are we hammering in a nail an ancient religious ritual to prevent plague? From the perspective of Livy, writing several centuries later, he can't be sure which cause it was in any particular year. So let's now make another time jump, this time to the late 2nd century CE, to the High Empire, and to historians who are steeped both in the Roman annalistic tradition and in the Greek Thucydidean one. Yes, Thucydides will continue to show up even in this, this presentation about the Roman side of things. Next slide, please. And this is also the era of the Antonine plague, one of the great plagues of antiquity, not an endemic disease. Some scholars believe it may have been smallpox, but as with the Thucydidean, as with the plague of Athens, there is not the scientific data, archaeological data yet to demonstrate anything for certain. This plague is first attested in Seleucia, which is today in the greater Baghdad area, in 165 and 166 CE, where the armies of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus were campaigning against the Parthians. These armies brought it back to the Western Empire and throughout the Mediterranean. And the estimates range widely. It may have killed between 5 and 10 million people over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, there may have been an outbreak in the city of Nisibis, which is circled with an orange circle on the slide, and it's on the border between Turkey and Syria, a bit earlier in 165 CE. And we know this because the satirist Lucian in the late 160s made fun of a historian who described a plague in Nisibis by lifting the description wholesale from Thucydides. Next slide, please. This historian, whom Lucian calls Preparaeus Calpurnianus, a very Roman name despite his Greek affectations, is otherwise unknown. Lucian claims that he wrote a very bad history of the Parthian wars of Marcus Aurelius that included all the highlights of Thucydides plagiarized basically word for word. And so Lucian says, well, why should I even tell you of the sort of plague that Preparaeus brought down on the people of Nisibis, who declined to take the Roman side? He lifted that from Thucydides in its entirety, except just for the Pelargicum and the long walls where those who had at that time caught the plague had settled. Then again, it even began in Ethiopia, as in Thucydides, then descended into Egypt and the vast territory of the great king, where it stayed, and a good thing too. For my part, I left this historian still burying his wretched Athenians at Nisibis. So for all of Lucian's scorn, there's an irony here that may be intentional or may not. Lucian was writing his satirical treatise just as the plague was beginning to spread across the entirety of the Mediterranean world. Perhaps another strike against Preparaeus is his fantasy that this plague will stay in one city and an enemy one at that. Preparaeus aside, we do not actually have much in the way of a historiographical account of the Antonine plague. Our best sources are those such as David mentioned in his introduction, Aelius Aristides, who became ill with the plague, and Galen, a contemporary doctor. But we do have a comment by the historian Commodus about the resurgence of probably the same pathogen during the reign of the emperor Commodus in 189 CE. Next slide. Commodus, of course, is the, if you recall the film Gladiator, he's the bad emperor of that film. And you'll recognize a lot of the beats of Dio's account. Moreover, he writes, a great pestilence occurred, the greatest of any of which I have knowledge, for 2,000 persons often died in Rome in a single day. Then too, many others, not only in the city, but throughout the entire empire, perished at the hands of criminals who smeared deadly drugs on tiny needles, and for pay infected people with poison by means of these instruments. Now, the death of these victims passed unheeded, for Commodus was a greater curse to the Romans than any pestilence or any crime. So here again, plague overlaps with anxieties and rumors of social breakdown, gangs of hired poisoners. But it's also a comparandum, a framework for taking stock of the ruler. And the plague is, what we can see is, if Dio's account is correct, a very serious, when we had 2,000 people dying a day in the United States earlier last year, that was the height of our pandemic. And to consider that Rome, which may have had a population of just 1 million people, 2,000 dying per day, that's so the scale of that is quite large. But what is this function? How does this function for Dio as a comparandum? Imagine how bad it is for 2,000 people in your city to die every day. Well, no one even cared about that because the emperor was so much worse. Perhaps a bit of exaggerated rhetoric there. And this takes us to the document that has been the background for this set of slides. A bronze inscription containing part of a senator's speech from 1676 or 177, in which the unknown speaker thanks the emperors, in this case Marcus Aurelius, co-ruling with his son Lucius Commodus, and those names allow us to date this speech quite specifically, for suggesting the law that our senator is about to formally propose. So the tablet begins and ends mid-sentence. So we get just a portion of this speech that was given in the Senate relating to sort of what the legislative procedure of the day. But the very beginning of it is suggestive because it's incredibly rich in metaphors of plague. Next slide, please. This disease, in its magnitude, could not be healed by any medicine, and it could not. But our emperor's entire concern is to nurse back and restore to perfect health the communal good, however great the sickness that overwhelms it and brings it to death's door. Above all, they turn their attention to the question, what cause was giving strength to this sickness? So if this was where our fragment ended, we would probably think we had a rather remarkable document about the imperial response to a plague that we know was at that time ravaging the Roman world. Right here, our emperors, our philosophical emperor Marcus Aurelius, is like Thucydides, turning his attention to causes, right, trying to find out what caused this sickness, how can he bring his empire back to health? But in fact, that's not our senatorial speaker's concern at all. Next slide, please. It turns out that the disease infecting the Commonwealth that our speaker is so grateful the emperors are addressing is not literal plague, but the high taxes on and high costs of gladiators for the shows that local elites were expected to put on in their towns. What cause was giving strength to this sickness? Whence did these foul and unjust taxes hold sway? And so on and so on. The proposed law, as we find out in the subsequent portions of the speech, would eliminated the tax and set price caps on how much the owner of a gladiatorial school could charge per fighter. Therefore, says our speaker, as he wraps up the rhetorical portion of the speech before he gets into the technicalities of what this law would actually do, I move first of all that thanks be given to the greatest emperors who, setting aside the needs of the treasury, with health-bringing remedies, have stabilized the tottering situations of the emperor's towns and their leading men's fortunes, which were collapsing into ruins. So, do we have here a document of the economic upheavals wrought by an actual plague, such that we see, in effect, imperial subsidies for things going on public expenses that can no longer be borne by the local communities. At the same time, we perhaps see that as in 2020, so in 177, the plague that the legislative class is really concerned about is the one that threatens their pocketbooks. And so I hope I've now tried to get us sort of through into the beginnings of late antiquity, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to Henry Gruber, who can talk with much greater authority about plagues in the Roman Empire.
Well, thank you for that, and thank everybody for coming. Today, I'm going to talk a bit about the Justinianic pandemic. The Justinianic pandemic is the modern name for an outbreak of bubonic plague that struck the Mediterranean world beginning in the 540s CE. The disease struck a Roman Empire that was already in transition. Most vividly, the western half had disintegrated into a collection of so-called barbarian successor states. The Eastern Roman Empire, though, was not in decline. East Roman port cities bustled with merchants and crowds, and a frisson of Christian doctrinal tension always hung in the air. Every year, a grain fleet set out from Egypt to bring the bounty of empire to a Roman capital. Just now, no longer Rome, but rather Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, where the towering new church of the Hagia Sophia had just been erected. And in what must have augured great excitement for all, and is shown on this slide, the energetic Emperor Justinian had, in the 530s, begun to reconquer territory long ceded to the barbarians in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. It was at this point, in 541, that the disease outbreak we know as the Justinianic plague came to the attention of the ancients. Next slide, please. The historian Procopius describes what happened. During this time, there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. It did not come in a part of the world, nor upon certain men, nor did it confine itself to any season of the year, so that from such circumstances it might be possible to find subtle explanations of a cause. But it embraced the entire world, respecting neither sex nor age, and blighted the lives of all, even if they differed from one another in the most marked degree. Next slide, please. Procopius is our most sober narrative account. He's also one of the longest. And while there are certainly reasons to doubt certain aspects of his version, for example, he draws heavily on Thucydides for a model of how to describe a plague outbreak, the basic outline of the first wave is confirmed by other contemporary accounts. According to Procopius, the disease began in Pelusium in Egypt and spread from there both west to Alexandria and east up the coast into Gaza and Palestine. Eventually, it reached Constantinople in 542 and most of the known world, the Oikumene, by 543. I'll just say that I didn't make this map, but I think it's a very good map. I think the map maker is perhaps too conservative in the areas shaded in, but we can see here how the plague spread throughout the Mediterranean. Now, what was this plague? Procopius describes the symptoms at great length, so I'll here just quote one key passage. Next slide, please. So Procopius tells us that there's a fever, but it's mild. So not one of those who had contracted the disease expected to die from it. But on the same day in some cases, in others on the following day, and in the rest not many days later, a bubonic swelling developed. And this took place not only in the particular part of the body, which is called bubon, that is below the abdomen, but also inside the armpit, and in some cases also beside the ears, and at different points on the thighs. Next slide, please. This has long suggested to scholars that the disease is the bubonic plague, which is a disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and results in these telltale buboes. Recent paleogenetic analysis of the bacterium has confirmed this attribution. Yersinia pestis is also the pathogen that caused the bubonic plague outbreak in medieval Eurasia, known as the Black Death, and is currently responsible for about 10 to 15 deaths a year in the United States. It's become endemic amongst the prairie dog population, so if you're in the Southwest, don't pet them, even if they are cute. Next slide, please. Bubonic plague is a rodent disease, most classically transmitted by flea-ridden rats, but also known to be transmitted by various sorts of marmots and wild gerbils. The bacterium found ample hosts among the rat population of the Roman world, especially on the merchant ships that plied grain across the Mediterranean, especially this Egypt-Constantinople trip. But the Roman world was vulnerable to this disease in more ways than just its urbanism and merchant shipping. Climatic conditions had worsened, perhaps significantly, and the empire was at war, which, as we know, can lead to plagues, both real and metaphorical. When bubonic plague broke out, therefore, in Constantinople in 542, it was devastating. Next slide, please. Procopius tells us that the disease in Byzantium, that is Constantinople, ran a course of 4 months, and its greatest virulence lasted about 3. First, the deaths were a little more than the normal, then the mortality rose still higher, and afterwards the tale of the dead reached 5,000 a day, and again it even came to 10,000 and still more than that. Now in the beginning, each man attended to the burial of the dead of his own house, and these they threw even into the tombs of others, either escaping detection or using violence. But afterwards, that is after these tombs filled up, confusion and disorder everywhere became complete. Procopius goes on to describe at length the societal impact of the imperial response, and his whole account is really worth reading, especially now. In Constantinople, at least, it seems clear that this was a devastating outbreak of pandemic disease that shook an urban Roman center to its core. Outside of the capital city, however, the picture becomes much murkier. Next slide, please. My own research focuses on Spain, and there is only one sentence that describes the first outbreak there. It is an anonymous marginal note in an obscure chronicle written at an unknown place in Spain at an unknown date. It simply says, for a year that's either 542 or 543, that in those days, the groin plague ground down almost all of Hispania. It's no Procopius, but it seems to describe the bubonic plague. And outside of Gregory of Tours' accounts of the plague in Gaul, there's little better evidence for anywhere in the West. I'll just say this aside, Gregory is very interesting. He writes as an adult man about the plague that he experienced as a very young child, and very clearly he recounts the plague story. This has recently been shown in an article in the way that his mother told him about it, and he recalls that as an adult. Anyway, the limited written evidence has led scholars in recent years to search for other types of evidence for the extent of this bubonic plague pandemic. Next slide, please. One project has been to collect evidence for mass graves. They are a feature of most of our plague accounts, and while not all mass graves are plague pits, there does seem to be a rise in the prevalence of these graves over the course of the 6th and especially the 7th centuries. As an aside, if you're an archaeologist and you know of late antique mass graves from the Mediterranean, please let me know. Next slide, please. Another extremely promising avenue of research is based on the recent identification of the bacterium that causes the disease in ancient burials, most spectacularly at 6th century rural sites in Bavaria, far from the Mediterranean. There is now a large interdisciplinary and international project to identify possible victims of plague, sequence pathogen DNA from their dental calculus, and study it to see whether they in fact had plague when they died. And then we can place that strain of plague into Yersinia phylogenetic tree and hopefully eventually be able to track the path of specific outbreaks as they occurred and recurred. These subsequent outbreaks struck the Mediterranean world at seemingly fairly regular intervals, but the unevenness of the written record obscures the nature of these so-called waves or amplification effects. But bubonic plague was present from 541 on in the Mediterranean before disappearing around 750 until it returned catastrophically in 1356. Next slide, please. There's been a trend to view this new plague-ridden Mediterranean as somehow key to the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of antiquity, or the, quote, end of the ancient world. Arguments about the demographic impact of the pandemic and that demographic collapse's impact on trade, urbanism, and eschatological thinking have dovetailed with our own current climate crisis and pandemic to put a new spin on always simmering debates about the fall of Rome. Next slide, please. There has, however, been strong pushback against those who see the pandemic as a major historical agent, and the question of whether or not the Justinian pandemic led to the end of Rome or was, quote, inconsequential is an ongoing and exciting debate in the field of late antiquity. Thank you very much, and I will now pass back to David.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. That's really a tremendous span. We've covered over 1,000 years of history, and both endemic diseases, epidemic diseases, and pandemic diseases. And so now I see that now I think it's time for questions and possibly some answers. And there are 2 questions already in the question section. So the first one says, well, so congratulates us on awesome discussions. One thing that people are starting to acknowledge and appreciate as a reality is not just the death toll of COVID, but also the chronic disabling effects of the virus for those who had COVID and survived So where estimates are that about 1/3 of people who had COVID have chronic effects lasting at least 9 months. We often think about the effects of the plague of Athens in terms of deaths, loss of fighting force, etc., but not in terms of disability. Is there any evidence for the potentially disabling effects of the plague of Athens and the effect of that on Athens as a city and its morale? What about for any of the other plagues of antiquity discussed today? So a very good question. And so does anyone want to take that on? John, Catherine?
Yeah, perhaps I can. Yes, if you read the entire passage of Thucydides, different people got the plague in different sorts of ways. In some cases, it stops at certain points, like, for example, when it reaches the bowels. In other cases, it just keeps on going and going. So it was not the same for everybody. And this is according to the testimony of one person. So, of course, who himself, although very learned, is not a physician. So essentially, it did affect people in different ways, some more severely than others. But interestingly enough, some people did survive and others did not. Catherine, if you can...
Also, I'm sorry, did you finish? Or?
No.
No, so Thucydides also says then that there were after effects. So in particular, in line with medical theory of the time, where the disease matter that was causing the illness in the first place has to get out of the body. It does that via the extremities. And so what then happens with people was they might survive, but they may have lost to gangrene their nose or their fingers or toes or their penises. And this was one of the longer term effects of this. But it's also the case that the economic and manpower records, as far as we can tell for Athens, don't really leave any trace of all of this. We don't see in Thucydides, for example, that the Athenians had trouble raising an army after this point. And so some scholars have actually doubted whether Thucydides made up the plague just on his own.
That's a very interesting point, David. And I think one of the most interesting articles was penned by my friend and colleague at the University of Macquarie in Australia, Tom Hillard. And Tom actually saw that it was not until about 415 BC that the population of Athens got big enough to mount once more a major campaign. And that campaign, of course, was the ill-fated Sicilian expedition. And one of the points that he concluded in his article was that the plague of Athens, whatever the pathogen was, actually did not affect the young as badly as it affected the older population. Although Myrtis, of course, is a wonderful exception.
Good. So, right, then we have others. So we have, let's see now. So the Justinian plague is close in time period to the rise of Islam. Is there any connection? I guess we can ask Henry about that.
Sure. Well, that's a very tough question to answer because it's very difficult to assign specific historical causation to pandemic diseases, and it's also our understanding of pre-Islamic Arabia is also fragmentary. However, I think that under a certain understanding of what the early Islamic movement was and its sort of specific eschatological ends, perhaps we can argue that the general rise that some have seen in apocalyptic thinking in the Eastern Mediterranean in the period that sort of followed the the first outbreak and continued, we see this in a rise perhaps in commentaries on the Book of Revelation, would make it, would provide sort of a more fertile ground for the type of religious movement that perhaps early Islam was. But it's very difficult, I think, to draw out specific historical causation between pandemic diseases and large-scale shifts in spiritual and religious consciousness. But it is definitely a question people have thought about.
Right. We have another question. We have several questions now from identified participants. So Jacques Delvoye has asked, so what do we know about the geographic range of the plague of Athens? Did it reach Sparta and other cities?
And the brief answer to that is yes, it did. Thucydides said that it was known throughout the Greek world, but it was the worst in Athens.
Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, Thucydides also tells us that it began in sub-Saharan Africa and was then rose. And interestingly, the way in which he describes its descent from the mountainous areas there and then ultimately to Athens mirrors the course of the disease in an individual human body, going from top to toe.
That's nice.
Right. My philosophical colleague, David Glidden, hi there, I haven't seen you in a long time, from Riverside, is asking, is there any archaeological DNA evidence comparing those who died from plague with those who survived the plague but died from other causes later in life? So that's presumably looking at their whole genomes and seeing whether there were genetic factors which influenced their survival. Anybody know?
Yeah, the problem with that is it's a very interesting conundrum we're in, because in most cases, the most effective evidence that we get of DNA is through mitochondrial DNA, which only traces DNA through the mother's side. Most attempts at nuclear DNA sequencing of diseases or of consanguinity of people and so forth are very few and far between. They're also extremely expensive. So if you were a drug company trying to make billions of dollars by producing literally billions of vaccines, there is money to do it. But if you're a poor archaeologist, it becomes very difficult because, among other things, your DNA results, in order to be valid, have to be confirmed by two independent laboratories, which makes it really difficult. So the short answer to that is that sort of detailed question that you ask, which is a very good one, is almost impossible at the present time to answer, because we just don't have enough DNA information.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Keith Bishop asks about the linguistic question. So did Thucydides use the word plague, so striking? And has anyone examined the etymological significance of any, if any, of the words used for it in the descriptions? And of course, the word that Thucydides uses is loimos, which is then the same as we have in Homer, for example, at the beginning of the Iliad. And that's the generally used Greek word for this. Lydia mentioned the number of words that were used in the Roman annales. So in particular, pestis, pestilentia. So I think those would be the questions. Does anybody know anything about the etymology of loimos?
I don't know anything about the etymology of loimos. I mean, I can comment on the broader aspect of the question, which is that, yes, he calls it loimos. He also calls it just heinosos.
Yes.
The sickness, as though, and people have written interestingly on this, as though as though the more general term has been made synonymous with this smaller instance of illness. He doesn't use the noun plague, as far as I know, of the plague. But what is interesting is the kind of language he uses to talk about the way it came upon people. And he does use language that is reminiscent of an attack from outside, a swooping down, a descent upon, as though it's a missile that has hit you. And I was reading some articles this weekend that were talking about how this then can go back, if we think of our archer Apollo, the plague god, with his bows and arrows that we have in the Iliad, when he comes down to cause the plague at the beginning of the Iliad, and he comes down, great phrase, like the knight, and starts to shoot his arrows at the dogs and then the human beings. So there is this consistent sort of thematic complex, both in Thucydides and in other authors, that the plague is a kind of missile coming at you from the outside.
Right. The other thing to note, of course, is that in ancient medical theory of nosology, the classification of diseases, in general, there was a tendency to group diseases together rather than separating them. And giving them each individual names. And so that too can influence our problems in trying to identify in retrospective diagnoses what was going on. And of course, one reason for that is simply the idea that actually diseases come, all of them, from the interaction of your body with its environment. And therefore, it's all your body acting up in a certain way, rather than the idea that there's some odd thing from outside that's come into you and is causing this problem. So all of those sorts of theoretical questions influence our ability to draw out from ancient accounts the kind of thing that we're interested in. And nosology, this idea of giving things separate names, really only takes hold in medical science with the germ theory of disease that comes up in the middle of the 19th century from Robert Koch. Let's see, do we have more people here? So Elizabeth Lockhart has asked, so the parallel between the contagion of plagues and the contagion of war struck me as telling and relevant to today's epidemic of community violence and COVID. Did classic authors and historians have any wisdom on how to stop these parallel plagues? Well, you could lower taxes. That's and that's actually the same kind of thing that we've done. Lydia, yeah?
I can try to, I mean, I'm afraid I will have, my answer will not be very optimistic, but more along those same lines. I mean, one of the things is that I think this question really brings into focus kind of what perspective are our ancient writers writing from, and what do they consider a sort of stable community or a stable state? I mean, actually in Livy's account of the Republic, one of the main problems with plague is that it prevents you from going to war. And yet you'll say nothing happened for 3 years because there was too much disease. So we might say, well, so there's a kind of inverse relationship between the kind of war that you want, which is the kind of regular defensive or offensive war against the communities around you, which is and actually is in a kind of inverse relationship with disease. On the other hand, internal war, which we might consider, we tend to be rather more sympathetic to the plebeians who want a share of equal rights than say Livy is. So this kind of struggle for equality or struggle over power within the city or over resources within the city is exactly what what the kind of writers such as Livy present as, right? That's what the plague is, and so that's what you need to sort of tamp down. I mean, this idea, it's something quite telling that in his stories we have to appoint a dictator to get rid of the plague, which is what is the Roman answer to plague? It's a kind of military solution, with a religious ritual, but it's again a kind of centralization of power and order. Like, you have to put the community back in order in a very top-down sort of way. Whether that's about the relationship with the gods that will try to alleviate the pestilence, or whether it's about the willingness of the lower classes to obey the orders of the state. So I would say that I would tend to think that we would sort of not want to follow the lessons of some of these authors. Try to do them a bit better. Right.
Thank you. So I think I'm being prompted here to take one final question. And the next person on the list is Sharon Gerstel, our own. So what are the indications of plague in burials or in skeletal pathologies other than having a large number of bodies buried together? And John is shaking his head, none. And I think
yeah, right. As far as I know, Sharon, there's really no clear evidence. So with individual tombs, we know very little about the plague of Athens, and it's certainly one of those diseases that does not appear to have left great scars on the bone, on the skeletal evidence, on the skeletal remains, and so really no, if we had a situation like Egypt with desiccation, where the preservation of human corpses is a lot better, we could analyze the flesh, but we don't have that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Good. Well, so I'm sorry, that's all the time we apparently have for a question and answer. I'll look over the rest of the questions, and if I can, then I'll try to write some answers. Anybody else is welcome to do that as well. And then I'll just hand over now to Alex Purves, who will conclude this session.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for moderating, and thank you to our panelists and for those really brilliant questions. And I too am sorry. I think some of the panelists may have time to perhaps answer a couple of questions in the chat, in typing in the Q&A. But that was really fascinating and so enlightening. Thank you to everybody. That was wonderful. So with the support of donors like Joan and many of you at this webinar, Classics can thrive as a department and support the wonderful scholarship, which we've just seen, of our faculty, students, and the broader UCLA community. As many of you may know, the department has spent several years raising funds for a centennial graduate fellowship to support a graduate student in our department. Last year, we were able to endow this fund at $100,000, a momentous achievement only possible with the support of our alumni and friends. We hope to continue to grow this endowment over time with annual donations. After this event, you will receive a follow-up email with a recording of this panel. We hope you will consider a donation of any size towards our fellowship. I think there may also be a link in the chat as well if you'd like to contribute that way. It was a real pleasure to kind of share this evening with you. Thank you so much again for all of your support. We can't wait to see you in person again soon. Thanks to everybody, and good night.